The quiet loneliness of people who notice everything. The room you're always outside of. You are in the middle of a conversation and you already know how it ends. Not because you are cynical, not because you have stopped caring, but because you noticed, 3 sentences ago, the slight shift in someone's tone, the almost imperceptible way they glanced away before answering, the millisecond of hesitation that told you something true was being replaced by something easier. You registered all of it. You processed all of it. And then you smiled and kept the conversation going because explaining what you just perceived would take longer than the conversation itself allows. This is your life. Not the dramatic version of loneliness. Not the empty apartment, the unanswered messages, the obvious isolation. The version you carry is quieter and stranger than that. It lives inside full rooms. It arrives in the middle of laughter. It exists precisely in the moments when, by every external measure, you are not alone at all. You notice everything. The tension behind someone's cheerfulness. The way a silence between 2 people holds something unresolved. The exact moment a group's energy shifts from genuine to performed. You catch these things the way other people catch words. Automatically, involuntarily, as basic as breathing. And for most of your life, you have assumed that everyone else catches them too. They don't. And that gap, between what you perceive and what the people around you seem to perceive, is where your particular loneliness lives. Not in the absence of people. In the presence of a world that moves at a frequency you were never asked if you wanted to hear. This video is not going to tell you that your sensitivity is a superpower. You have heard that before, and it is never quite fit. Because superpowers don't leave you exhausted after ordinary conversations. They don't make you spend the drive home replaying every unspoken thing in a room. They don't make you feel again and again like you are watching everyone else from behind a glass wall that you didn't build and cannot find the door to. What this video will do is something different. It will name what is actually happening inside you. The nervous system patterns, the identity fractures, the specific psychological architecture of a person who processes the world at a resolution most people never reach. Not to fix it, not to reframe it into something more comfortable, but because the loneliness of noticing everything is one of the most invisible forms of human suffering, and invisible suffering has a particular way of convincing you that it isn't real. It is real, and somewhere in the next chapters, you will recognize yourself in ways that may feel uncomfortably precise, because what you have always experienced as a personal strangeness is, in fact, a psychological pattern with a name, a mechanism, and a cost that has never been fully explained to you. Until now. You were never just sensitive. They said it like a diagnosis: too sensitive, too intense, too affected by things that other people seem to move through without friction. And because you were young and because the people saying it seemed so certain, you believed them. You filed it under personal defect and spent years trying to correct something that was never broken in the first place. What you were, what you are, is not sensitive in the way that word is commonly used. Sensitivity implies a lowered threshold, a kind of emotional fragility, a reaction that exceeds what the situation warrants. But that is not what happens inside you. What happens inside you is perception. High-resolution, involuntary, relentless perception. Your nervous system doesn't react more, it registers more. It picks up signals that most people's systems filter out before they ever reach conscious awareness. The data arrives whether you want it or not. This is not a flaw in your emotional calibration. It is a difference in your perceptual architecture. And that difference changes everything about how you experience being alive. It changes how much a conversation costs you. It changes what you need after being around people. It changes why certain environments feel like sustained assault, and others feel like the first breath after being underwater too long. Consider what this means in practice. When you walk into a room, you are not simply seeing the people in it. You are reading the history between them, the unspoken hierarchy. The person who is performing ease and the person whose stillness is actually tension. You are absorbing the temperature of the room before anyone has said a word to you. Most people receive a fraction of this and call it intuition. For you, it is not intuition. It is a continuous stream of data that does not pause and cannot be switched off. and it has been running since before you had the language to describe what it was. The tragedy of being told you were too sensitive is not just that it was inaccurate. It is that it taught you to apologize for the very faculty that made you perceptive, intelligent, and capable of understanding things others missed entirely. You spent years trying to lower the volume on something that was never too loud. You were trying to break a sense organ because the people around you didn't have it and assumed its absence was the norm. You were never too much. You were simply running a process that most people around you had no framework to understand, including you, the exhaustion. Nobody sees. You are tired in a way that doesn't show up on your face. Not the tiredness that comes from too little sleep, or too much work, or an unusually difficult week. The tiredness you carry is structural. It is the result of processing, continuously and involuntarily, every emotional signal in every room you enter. The flicker of irritation someone suppressed before answering you. The undercurrent of anxiety in a conversation that appeared perfectly relaxed. The way the energy in a group shifted when one particular person walked in. Something everyone felt and nobody named. You named it, internally, automatically. And then you kept going. Because what else do you do? Most people leave a social situation carrying the surface of it. The words exchanged, the plans made, the general impression of how it went. You leave carrying the subtext, the unresolved tensions, the things that were almost said, the emotional weight of a room that distributed itself invisibly across everyone present, but landed on you with full force, because you were the one who could feel it. This is not emotional weakness. It is the metabolic cost of a perceptual system operating at high intensity in environments that were never designed with that system in mind. Your exhaustion is real. It is neurological. And the fact that it is invisible, that you look fine, that you functioned, that no one would ever guess, is precisely what makes it so isolating. You can't explain it without sounding dramatic, so most of the time you don't. And the cost of that silence is a fatigue that compounds quietly, year after year, in a body that has been working harder than anyone around you realized. When connection feels like performance. There is a version of you that appears in social situations. It is fluent and functional. It knows how to respond at the right pace, how to match the emotional register of the room, how to make people feel comfortable. It can carry a conversation, land a joke, ask the right questions. From the outside, it looks like connection. And sometimes in the middle of it, you can almost convince yourself that it is. But you know the difference. Real connection for you has a texture that is almost physical. A sensation of being received at the level where you actually exist. It is rare enough that you remember specific moments of it years later with disproportionate clarity. Everything else, the fluid, functional social performance you deliver reliably, is a sophisticated adaptation. Not dishonesty exactly, more like translation. You translate yourself into a frequency others can receive, and the translation costs something that doesn't have a name. Small talk is not boring to you because you are arrogant. It is unbearable because it requires you to shrink the part of you that is most alive and most present, to set aside what you actually noticed, what you actually felt, what actually interested you about this moment, and replace it with something lighter, safer, easier to hold. Every time you do it, there is a small, quiet betrayal happening, not of the other person, of yourself. And here is the part that almost no one talks about. The performance works. That is what makes it so dangerous. People respond to the edited version of you with warmth, with ease, with the kind of casual affection that the unedited version rarely received. So the lesson gets reinforced again and again. The translated self is the one that gets loved, and the real self is the one that gets tolerated at best. You learn to trade depth for acceptance. And for a while the trade feels like wisdom. But something quietly keeps score. Every conversation in which you performed connection instead of experiencing it leaves a residue, a faint sense of having been present without having been there. You go home from an evening that looked, by every external measure, like a success, and you feel a loneliness that makes no sense given how many people you just spent time with. The loneliness makes no sense because the connection was real for them and a performance for you. Over time, that betrayal accumulates. And the self that keeps getting edited out of conversations starts to feel less like a version of you and more like the only real one, the one that never quite makes it into the room, the inner conversation that never stops. It goes somewhere. Everything you didn't say, every observation you didn't share, every layer of meaning you registered and then set aside to keep the social rhythm intact, it doesn't disappear. It goes inward. And inward, it finds a world that is in many ways more vivid, more populated, and more emotionally alive than the external one ever manages to be. You have entire conversations inside your mind that no one else will ever hear, not because you are withholding, but because the inner conversation moves faster, goes deeper, and reaches places that the external conversation, with its pacing requirements and its need for mutual comprehension, simply cannot follow. By the time you finish saying one sentence out loud, your inner world has already explored 5 implications of it, questioned 2 of its assumptions, and arrived somewhere the other person hasn't even noticed you started going. This inner world is where you are most fully yourself. It is where your perception is not a burden but a language, where every nuance you catch becomes part of an ongoing inquiry into what life is actually made of beneath its surface. Some people find it in books, some in music that seems to already know what they feel, some in the middle of the night, when the world finally goes quiet enough for the inner conversation to rise to the surface without interruption. But there is a cost to living most fully inside yourself. The richer the inner world becomes, the wider the gap feels between what happens inside and what is possible outside. And at some point, without quite deciding to, you begin to wonder if anyone out there could ever actually live inside that conversation with you, or if you have always been, at the deepest level, alone with it. You learned to disappear politely. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in small corrections. The moment you shared something real and watched the other person's eyes go slightly blank. Not cruel, just unreachable. The times your depth landed in a room like an object no one knew how to pick up. The accumulated experience of offering the truest version of what you saw or felt, and receiving in return a polite deflection, a subject change, a smile that meant, "I don't know what to do with that." You learned, not consciously. The nervous system learns faster than the mind does. It registered the pattern. Depth creates distance. Authenticity creates discomfort. The full version of you is too much, not because people are cruel, but because most people are simply not equipped to hold that much perceptual and emotional density in a casual conversation. So you built a version of yourself that fit. Lighter, more accessible, fluent in the social codes that make people feel at ease. You became, without ever formally deciding to, remarkably skilled at being present in a way that asked nothing difficult from anyone around you. And it worked. People liked you. Conversations flowed. You stopped making others uncomfortable. The only problem was that you were no longer there. Not entirely. A version of you was, the one that had learned to disappear politely, to make its exit so graceful and so well-timed that no one ever noticed it was leaving. But the part of you that noticed everything, that felt everything, that needed to be met at the level where it actually lived, that part learned to wait. And waiting, over years, starts to feel indistinguishable from being gone. The weight of unspoken things. You know things nobody told you. You know when a marriage in the room is in trouble, not because anyone said so, but because of the specific way 2 people don't look at each other. You know when someone's cheerfulness is a performance, not a lie exactly, but a version of themselves they've deployed to get through the day without falling apart. You know when a conversation that appears friendly is actually a negotiation, when an apology isn't one, when a silence between 2 people is carrying something neither of them is ready to name. And you carry all of it, not by choice. There is no mechanism to unnotice what you have noticed. The perception arrives fully formed, often before you've decided whether you wanted it. And because the people around you didn't register the same thing, because to them the room was just a room, and the conversation was just a conversation, there is no one to process it with. The emotional truth you caught has no external address, so it stays inside you. This is one of the least discussed forms of emotional weight. The burden not of your own unprocessed feelings, but of other people's unacknowledged ones, received by your nervous system, carried in your body, with nowhere to go. Over time, it creates a particular kind of heaviness. Not depression exactly, more like being perpetually full of something that has no outlet. A saturation. And it changes how you move through the world. You begin to brace before entering rooms, not because you fear people, but because you know you will leave carrying more than you came with. You start to ration your exposure to certain environments and certain people, not out of judgment, but out of a quiet self-protection you can rarely explain to anyone. You become an unwilling archive of everyone else's unspoken emotional lives, and an archive has no way to set anything down. What makes it lonelier still is that the people whose feelings you carried often have no idea you carried them. The friend whose grief you sensed and silently held space for. The colleague whose fear you registered and gently worked around. They walked away lighter, sometimes without knowing why, and you walked away heavier, always knowing exactly why. The exchange was invisible, uncredited, and entirely one-directional. And beneath it, something lonelier still. The knowledge that you perceived something true, something real, something that mattered, and that the very accuracy of your perception guaranteed you would have to carry it alone. Why you feel closest to people who aren't there. There is someone, or something, that has understood you better than most people in your actual life ever have. A character in a novel who articulated an inner experience so precisely that you had to stop reading and sit with it. A musician whose work seemed to already know the specific shape of something you had never been able to explain. A philosopher dead for centuries, who described your exact internal architecture with more accuracy than anyone you have ever met in person. A film that ended and left you feeling inexplicably less alone than you had felt before pressing play. This is not escapism. This is a hyper-perceptive person finding, in art and in the minds of the unusually perceptive dead, the quality of reception they cannot reliably find in ordinary social life. When someone's creative work operates at the level of depth you naturally inhabit, there is a meeting that occurs, a genuine resonance between two perceptual systems, across time or fiction, that can feel more real than most conversations you have in person. The problem is what this reveals. If your deepest sense of being understood comes primarily from people who are not present, from characters, from artists, from voices that cannot respond to you, that do not know you exist, then there is a loneliness inside the comfort. You are being met, but only in one direction. The resonance is real, but the relationship is not. And somewhere beneath the relief of being understood by a book or a song, there is a question that doesn't go away. There is also a subtler effect at work. The more reliably you find deep reception in art and in the minds of the perceptive dead, the higher your unconscious standard for human connection becomes. You have experienced what it feels like to be met at full depth, even if only across the distance of a page. So when ordinary conversation offers you something shallower, the contrast is sharper than it would be for someone who had never tasted the alternative. The very thing that consoles you also quietly raises the bar that real people then fail to clear. This is not arrogance, though it can be mistaken for it. It is calibration. You know precisely what it feels like to be understood at the level you live at, because you have felt it, just rarely and mostly from people who cannot know you back. And so the comfort and the loneliness become braided together, impossible to separate, each one deepening the other. Is this the closest I am capable of getting? The misread of depth as distance. People have described you as hard to reach, perhaps as reserved, contained, difficult to read, maybe even cold, which is the one that tends to land with the most specific kind of pain, because you know more precisely than almost anyone how much feeling moves through you at any given moment. To be perceived as cold is to experience the ultimate inversion. The person who feels most is read as the person who feels least. This happens for a structural reason. Hyper-perceptive people process before they express. Where others speak to discover what they think, you tend to think, extensively, recursively, with full awareness of nuance and implication, before you speak. The internal processing is deep and constant. The external signal is measured, selective, delayed. To someone observing from outside, this pattern reads as distance, as unavailability, as a kind of emotional withholding that is, in fact, the precise opposite of what is occurring. You are not withholding. You are processing. And the processing takes time that the social moment doesn't always allow, in a culture that reads expressiveness as emotional presence and silence as absence. The result is a persistent misattunement. You experience yourself as intensely engaged while others experience you as somehow not quite there. The gap between your inner reality and your perceived outer one becomes another source of loneliness. Not because you are unseen, but because what is seen is so consistently the wrong thing. And misreadings have a way of becoming self-fulfilling. When people consistently experience you as distant, they approach you as though you are distant, with less warmth, less openness, fewer invitations into the kind of closeness that might have proven them wrong. Their behavior, shaped by their misperception, then produces exactly the distance they assumed was already there. You end up living inside a feedback loop you did not create and cannot easily interrupt, because correcting it would require explaining your entire inner process to someone who has already decided they understand you. There is a particular fatigue in being chronically misunderstood by people who are certain they have you figured out. It is not the fatigue of being unknown. It is the fatigue of being confidently known as the wrong person, and of slowly losing the energy to keep insisting otherwise. Being misread that completely, for that long, begins to distort the story you tell about yourself. What overstimulation actually is. You need more silence than most people understand, not because you are antisocial, not because you dislike people, or find them uninteresting, or are punishing anyone with your withdrawal. You need silence because your nervous system has been processing at a level of intensity that most people's systems never reach. And at some point, the system demands decompression with the same authority that a body demands sleep. Overstimulation, for a hyper-perceptive person, is not about noise volume. A quiet dinner with 3 people can be more neurologically demanding than a concert, because the concert doesn't require you to track the emotional subtext of everyone present, manage your own responses in real time, monitor the room's shifting dynamics, and simultaneously perform a version of yourself that won't make others feel the weight of what you're actually experiencing. The concert is just sound. The dinner is a sustained cognitive and emotional operation. When you withdraw after that, you are not being dramatic. You are doing what the body does when any system has been running at unsustainable output. You are recovering. The solitude is not a symptom of something wrong. It is a biological response to a perceptual system that has been operating in high-intensity mode in an environment that doesn't accommodate it. What makes this isolating is that the recovery is invisible to everyone else. They see someone who left early, who went quiet, who needs more alone time than seems reasonable. They don't see the neurological reality beneath it. And in the gap between what they see and what is actually happening, something begins to calcify. A belief, forming slowly in the dark, that you are simply built for less connection than other people. The identity built around not being understood. At some point, it stopped feeling like a circumstance and started feeling like a fact. Not a painful fact, just a fact. The way the color of your eyes is a fact, or the sound of your own voice. I am someone who is not fully known. It became load-bearing. Part of how you organized your expectations, your relationships, your sense of what was possible. You stopped waiting to be understood and started building a life around the assumption that you wouldn't be. This is one of the most consequential shifts a person can make without noticing they made it. Because once that belief becomes identity, once I am not someone who gets to be fully known, moves from wound to self-concept, it begins to function as a filter. You unconsciously select for relationships that confirm it. You read distance in people who might have come closer if you'd stayed. You preemptively withdraw before the moment of misunderstanding that you've already predicted. The identity protects itself. It finds evidence. It builds structure. And it does this quietly without drama, in ways that feel like realism rather than self-limitation. You are not being negative, you are being accurate, or so it feels. Because the evidence is real. The misreadings happened. The gaps were genuine. The loneliness was earned through actual experience, not imagined. But there is a difference between a pattern that describes your past and a belief that forecloses your future. And somewhere in the years of compounding evidence, that line got crossed without your permission. The identity of the unseen person is a prison built from true things, the grief of almost. There is a specific kind of loss that has no ceremony, no clear ending, no moment you can point to and say, that is when it stopped. Just a gradual, quiet withdrawal of possibility. A connection that held real promise, that contained moments of genuine recognition, that made you believe, briefly, that the gap might be crossable, and then didn't sustain it. Didn't go deep enough. Reached a point where the other person's capacity ended and yours kept going, and the distance that opened in that gap was never addressed, only gradually accepted. You have grieved these almost connections in ways that confused even you. Because from the outside they didn't look like losses. The friendship didn't end in conflict. The relationship didn't collapse dramatically. Nothing was taken. It simply never fully arrived. And grief without a clear object is extraordinarily difficult to process. It has no ritual, no recognition, no socially legible form. You are mourning something that to everyone else never quite existed. This grief accumulates. Each almost adds to a reservoir of incompleteness that sits beneath your daily functioning. Not heavy enough to stop you, but present enough to color everything. The feeling that you have been close, many times, to something you needed, and that close is where it always ends. Not because of a fatal flaw in you, not because connection is impossible, but because the level at which you need to be met is genuinely rare, and rare things require a patience that can, over time, begin to feel indistinguishable from resignation. Perception without outlet. There is a pressure that builds when what you notice has nowhere to go. It is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates the way water accumulates behind a dam, gradually, invisibly, until the structure holding it begins to feel the weight in ways it wasn't designed to sustain. Every observation that goes unshared, every emotional truth perceived and then filed silently away, every moment of precise, involuntary awareness that entered you and had no exit. At some point, this becomes hypervigilance. The nervous system, unable to discharge what it has taken in, starts scanning with even greater intensity, as if finding the right signal, the right moment, the right person might finally create the release valve it has been searching for. The watching becomes more constant. The analysis becomes more recursive. The mind replays, reassesses, returns to moments already processed because processing them again feels, however briefly, like doing something with them. This is rumination, but not its anxious version. It is the rumination of a system that was built to perceive and was never given adequate conditions to express. It turns the perception inward because inward is the only available direction. And inward, without enough rest or outlet or genuine reception from another person, it starts to feel like being trapped inside your own frequency, unable to turn it down, unable to find anyone to tune into it, circling the same rich and exhausting interior with no clear way out. This is why so many perceptive people describe a sensation that sounds almost paradoxical, feeling overstimulated and understimulated at the same time. Overstimulated because the volume of incoming signal never drops. Understimulated because none of it is being met, answered, or returned by anyone capable of receiving it at the same depth. The system is flooded and starving in the same moment, drowning in perception while parched for genuine reception. And a perceptual system in that state does not simply tire. It begins slowly to turn against itself. The same intelligence that once felt like a gift starts to feel like a sentence. You can find yourself resenting the very acuity that defines you, wishing you could perceive less, feel less, notice less, wishing, in effect, that you were someone else. That wish never comes true, and the failure of it to come true is its own quiet grief. The irony is that the very intelligence of your perception becomes the architecture of your confinement. The question you stopped asking. You used to want to be known, not in the abstract, theoretical way, in the specific cellular way, The wanting that sits in the chest during a conversation that stays at the surface. The wanting that surfaces when someone asks how you are, and you calculate, in a fraction of a second, how much of the true answer they actually have room for. You used to feel that wanting as a kind of reaching, as a question held open, directed outward, searching. At some point, the question closed, not violently, not in despair, more like a door swinging shut in a room where the window has been open for too long. A quiet, exhausted cessation. You stopped reaching, not because you gave up on connection, but because reaching had cost something every time, and the return had been, too often, not enough to justify the exposure. The question was replaced by something more manageable. Adaptation. A sophisticated, functional, emotionally intelligent adaptation to a world that could not fully hold you. And here is what that costs. The question you stopped asking was not just about other people. It was about yourself. Because the search for someone who could truly see you was also, beneath everything, a search for confirmation that what you are, the full perceptual depth of it, the intensity, the loneliness, the endless interior, was worth being seen. When you stopped asking, you didn't just stop seeking connection. You quietly, almost imperceptibly, stopped insisting on your own reality. That is the deepest cost, not the loneliness. The slow, silent withdrawal of the claim you once made on being fully here. What it means to finally be witnessed. This is not the chapter where everything resolves. You have been inside a psychology that runs deep. Years of adaptation, of perception without outlet, of almost connections and quiet surrenders. That doesn't dissolve in a closing chapter. What can happen here is something smaller and more durable than resolution. Recognition. The specific rare experience of having your internal architecture named accurately enough that something in you relaxes, not because the loneliness is gone, but because the loneliness is finally real. That is what witnessing actually is. Not being fixed, not being celebrated, not having someone finally appreciate how much you feel. It is the experience of being perceived at the level where you actually exist, with the full complexity intact, without the softening, without the translation into something more socially manageable. It is a moment of correspondence between what is inside you and what someone outside you is actually tracking. You have had glimpses of it, in a book, in a conversation that surprised you, in a piece of music, in a moment with someone who looked at you differently than people usually do, and you felt, without being able to explain why, that the glass wall wasn't there. Those moments were real. They were not accidents or exceptions to a rule. They were evidence of a capacity, yours and others, that exists, even if it has been rare. But the most important witnessing is the one you give yourself. Understanding the architecture of your own perception, why you are the way you are, what it costs, what it means, is the first act of genuine self-recognition. Not self-improvement, not self-soothing. Self-recognition. The quiet, factual acknowledgement that what you carry is real, that the way you experience the world is real, and that a life built around the pretense that you are less than you are has always been asking too much of you. You notice everything. That has always been true. What changes now is whether you are willing to include yourself in what you notice.